I got with Joel and he forgot to put them up on the website, but now
So they're up.
getting them.
Okay, I think we're,
That looks
Sue, I
right.
think we're good.
Yeah, that looks right.
Let me
Does
do
the owl
this.
stay here or do we need to move it out or, do you know?
There we go. I think the owl's okay there.
Think?
Donovan can tell us.
Yeah.
Ray is a bit of a ringer.
Ray is a ringer?
She was the English teacher
Oh, no.
at Harding and was an English teacher at a place I think you used to
Here.
teach
Good for you.
for a
Ray.
time.
Where?
Little Harpeth Hall.
No, that was Margaret Wrinkle. I wish.
Ah, okay.
Margaret was awesome.
I taught music there.
Oh, was it music? I'm sorry.
In that life, I was doing musicals and choirs and taking music.
Oh.
And middle school music.
Right?
Especially middle school.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. I always got the weird, the father roles or the, and Cheaper by the Dozen, I was the father. But who was I in Crucible?
Yeah. What, is he asking what he should play in this?
No, he said, who was I?
Who was I in my high school Crucible?
I was in that, and I don't remember any of them.
John Putnam?
The
No, no.
unforgiving, implacable judge.
No.
Okay.
The Reverend. I was playing the Reverend back then, high school. Had some serious tabs, big tabs.
That is hilarious.
Yeah, that was very fun. So, are you okay here?
Okay, the fact that you were in theater cracks me up.
I was in movies when I was younger.
Oh, man.
My dad was a thespian, and so I was raised in theater.
Got a good voice, and if you stand close to him in the church, sometimes he can sing pretty good. He's not bad singer.
Is that right?
Well, in a range, and if somebody is on pitch near me,
Yeah.
one of my dear friends,
He can
Billy Carter, wrote in a book that I've got this friend Guy who compensates for pitch with volume, which is not a nice thing to say.
That is
But
not
it may
very
be
nice.
true.
That's my husband too.
What's the word on daddy this week?
Yeah, I can't.
I mean, if
I
you
can't keep on
spent
two verses.
30 minutes with him, you would think.
But then the 30 minutes is over and he keeps recycling. Right? I'm so sorry.
It's just
Really well done.
long
Yeah.
and hard,
Yep.
and
Nobody's watch, it's all.
Do they have church there that support it?
they used to, but
They've outlived everybody?
they really have.
Yeah.
I mean, he's outlived everything.
You know what I can do also? I can move this to his side,
Yes.
so it's not in your way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, fancy. What, you got the notes or something?
No, I just have a book on.
Ah.
There, I think that works.
That's awesome, thank you.
You were welcome. Hey, how are you doing? I know, so good to see you. Good, all the notes. A variety of reasons, not the least of which the COVID is taking a little more people. Couple of people got sick of the COVID. Somebody caught COVID. Not you. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. 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 Well, you all got it. Yeah. So.
Dan, I like
Oh, thanks.
sweaters, they're pretty colorful.
That's okay, thank you. So, that's happening. Look at this, we're getting a boardroom. Teacher.
All the L, I did. Sure.
All the praise.
See, I don't even know.
No, I
didn't. Yeah.
Yes, it is over.
Yeah, I just.
Yeah. That's how you advertise. Really, yeah.
That's what Guy said when he walked in the room. That wasn't me.
Yeah, COM would have had an issue.
Well,
Stevie,
making sure
right?
the phone's not gonna start ringing.
Oh, that's not a bad idea.
I can't find it. I'll find it when it rings. I think it's in the car.
Simon, is the owl in the right place there? That we can
It'll work.
Hello.
The nicest Zoom setup I've ever seen. Fancy. Are y'all ready?
Yeah.
Well, I am so glad to see everybody. Oh, God, back up and at it.
It's about time.
Been carrying that burden a long time.
Donovan came about a slacker.
I understand. So tonight, I think we'll focus on the two chapters, the strength of God and the teacher. So we're going to get into the, as my students would say, we're getting into the tea. Have you heard that phrase? It makes me feel so young. I never know what my students are saying anymore. So I'll just try to use some of the tea is like the scoop, the gossip. So kids will come up and go, what's the tea?
Spill the tea.
I know, I think that has to be where it came from, but that is not how they used it. I'm so excited to talk to you about these two chapters because we are going to, talk about Reverend Hartman and clergy people as perhaps real people.
As perhaps.
Yes, but don't despair because the other chapter is about the teacher and whether or not teachers are real people, sort of. And in both cases, we have to think about these two in the context of Winesburg and the grotesque, but also in moving George forward so that next week we can see how old George turns out. So let's begin with the strength of God. One of the things that critics love to point out is how interesting it is that Anderson split these two stories, the strength of God and the teacher, into two stories. And so one of the first questions or fundamental questions is, why does he do that? Are they two separate stories? Or are they one? So let's start with the old Reverend Curtis Hartman. Tell me your feelings or your reactions You know what I'm talking about? Have you read this one? Tell me.
Yeah.
Well, how did you react? Well, what about old Curtis? How'd you feel about him? You know, Susan, that face.
He sort of had his life in a box, everything was kind of figured out.
Okay, but
Well, that girl came along.
the girl comes along, sort of, right? Because she's been there. He just discovers her, right? And so this is a really interestingly different story than the others that we've read, because our first reaction is, oh, you creeper, yes? What is wrong with you? And what I would say is, this is a very Hawthornian story. It's so Hawthorne. And
Okay, excuse me, I don't know what that means.
Nathaniel Hawthorne.
I know Nathaniel Hawthorne, but I
Okay.
don't know what Hawthornian means.
Okay, so do you?
Everything you need to know is about the minister's black veil.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I will explain, okay? So if you have not read a lot of Hawthorne, Anderson, heavily influenced by Hawthorne, and Hawthorne also wrote about characters in communities, and one of his most famous stories is The Minister's Black Veil, which is a story about a minister who one day just dons this black veil and wears it all the time. And nobody in the congregation knows why. And of course, they start filling that vacuum with their own ideas about why, but he won't remove it. And
And he won't explain it.
he won't explain it. And it may end up turning him into a grotesque, because the question is, what is his problem, right? Why is he wearing this? And people in the congregation come up with all of these explanations. No, he had to have killed someone one time, or he's done something terrible. But the mystery of the veil is what maybe saves him or destroys him. All of that is to say, Hawthorne was really, really interested in this idea of watching and watchers. Yes? And he talks about them as what they are, voyeurs, people who just watch, people who watch. And with Hawthorne, and maybe this story, and this might shift the story a little bit for you, with Hawthorne, he felt some of that was necessary for an artist, but too much in the sense that it separates him from real life will ultimately destroy him. So let me work through some of that and try to clarify. So let's talk about ministers. Want to? I'm putting myself out there for the teacher part.
Yeah. Oh, we're out of time.
So, Donovan, thanks for volunteering. Are ministers voyeurs?
Well, it's interesting that word came up because when I talked to a guy about this book, I said, I love this book because, well, maybe I'm a voyeur because I like looking in on everybody's lives.
Okay, good. In the contemporary world, when we hear the word voyeur, we always attach bad things to it. Yes, it's always sort of lurking, creepy stuff. But all voyeur actually means is to watch. And are there positive things about that? So one of the things that's going on in these two chapters is Anderson is looking at two professions. One is a minister and the other is a teacher. And they are one person in the community and maybe a different or a more nuanced person or a more fleshed out person outside of the community. And so what kind of minister is Curtis Hartman?
He's always wondering if he's good enough to be a minister. He seems to me very insecure and feels like something is missing, but doesn't know what it is, hates writing the sermons, spends all this time and then wonders if did I get it right or not? Am I changing people's lives or not? And I'm sure ministers do that. As a teacher, I know that I did that.
Good. So one of the things that's going on here in these two chapters that are together is perhaps a suggestion that they have things in common. So you're absolutely right. Hartman is, oh gosh, a Presbyterian minister.
Better paid than the rest of the clergy in town.
I noticed.
Absolutely.
And look,
This is sad.
let's just look a little bit at him. So the Reverend Curtis Hartman was pastor of the Presbyterian Church of Winesburg and had been in that position 10 years. So he's been here for a decade. He was 40 years old. And it's so interesting because if you didn't know he was 40, in a lot of ways, he seems so much older, doesn't he? Why?
I don't know. Well, he kind of set in his ways, I think.
Yes, because, and this is going to go to, and this is true of all of these people in Winesburg, because he seems tired, sort of worn out.
Not unusual.
Okay. And by,
I thought he was having a midlife crisis.
okay. Oh, girl, hold on. And by his nature, very silent and reticent. To preach, standing in the pulpit before the people, was always a hardship for him. And from Wednesday morning until Saturday evening, he thought of nothing but the two sermons that must be preached on Sunday. Early on Sunday morning, he went to a little room called the study in the bell tower of the church and prayed. The Reverend Hartman was a tall man with a brown beard. His wife, a stout, nervous woman, was the daughter of a manufacturer of underwear at Cleveland, Ohio. The minister himself was rather a favorite in the town. The elders of the church liked him because he was quiet and unpretentious. The Presbyterian church held itself somewhat aloof from the other churches of Winesburg. It was larger and more imposing, and its minister was better paid. Next paragraph. I'm coming back to this. For a good many years after he came to Winesburg, things went well with Curtis Hartman. He was not one to arouse keen enthusiasm among the worshipers in his church, but on the other hand, he made no enemies. In reality, he was much in earnest and sometimes suffered prolonged periods of remorse because he could not go crying the word of God in the highways and byways of the town. He wondered if the flame of the Spirit really burned in him and dreamed of a day, hold on, when a strong, sweet new current of power would come like a great wind into his voice. So you get some backstory, and the you all will have to make this decision. He is part of so he's the minister of the Presbyterian Church in Winesburg, which holds itself a little aloof, and it's bigger and pays its ministers more than the other churches. I'm not going to question that. What I'm going to ask you is, what kind of minister does he seem to be? After 10 years in the pulpit.
Confident but uninspired.
Yeah,
Boring.
yes.
Boring, but he's okay. They don't want to get too excited. They don't want to get too excited about it either.
So part of what he's
They don't
doing,
want him out in the byways and highways.
exactly. So part of what he is suggesting, which I love, is that here's the deal with Curtis Hartman. He's competent. He's not lighting anybody on fire.
Not controversial.
Do what?
Not controversial.
Yes, he's not controversial. And he's not evangelical, right? There's a quietness, a reticence. So my question is that okay? So here's what I'm gonna say. Congregation, ministers. Is that okay?
Is that okay? No.
Why not?
Because it's a way to make a living, but it's not a way to
Make a life.
make a living.
Okay, beautiful. That sounded so great. It's a way to make a living, and he's doing fine, right? And his wife is proud and thinks of him as scholarly. Now, as a congregation, what do you all want or expect in a minister of the Lord?
Can I answer that one?
No. Because that might matter.
Do we need to leave?
No, because, I mean, honestly, wait, did you say you were on the board?
I'm currently on the administrative committee of Presbyterian.
Okay, let's talk about
Don't worry, I
this.
have no power. I have no
I'm on
power.
the session.
Okay, you too.
I've been on the session, yes.
So y'all, what are you looking for here in a minister? Be honest if you can. Pretend like they and God are not looking.
Well, we're certainly looking for people who are good preachers.
And what does that mean?
That means
Good teacher.
A teacher. Oh, here's that word again.
I think it's different,
What?
teaching and preaching.
You do?
well, we
I
have
think-
one of each. I mean, so, Donovan, I'm sure they're both good at both, but, Guy's the education person and Donovan's the executive preacher, so.
But what if you only had one? And do you expect different things from each?
Emphatically, yes.
Okay, tell me, Hank, what?
From the preacher, I think you see inspiration, insight, maybe a little bit of a cajolery. You need to get up off your butt and do more, do better. Do not be satisfied with yourself. And then I guess the last thing is what Preacher Hartman is waiting. The muse, the spirit, the voice, the feeling of a calling beyond the temporal, beyond the here and the now.
Yeah, wow, that was good. All right, then what about
Donovan
the,
took not note the first.
what about the teacher then?
more information, collaboration, give and take.
I don't know, good Presbyterians are all about the word, and we need a preacher that can help us understand the word through education, so that there are a variety of ways, like this class here, I mean,
Yeah.
variety of ways to learn about what God is wanting us to know through a teaching ministry.
Many of the congregations, the private congregations, the preacher is a teacher, it's not a preacher.
Yeah, so you're asking all the right questions, and they're usually questions we don't ask or think about. I sadly think about it all the time. Because, you know, I grew up in an evangelical church and then married a Pentecostal, right? I heard that sound. I told y'all when I met him, I was gonna marry him, and this is what John Bailey did. Right in front of my face. And so it is something I think about, you know. And one of the things the story is suggesting is that certain congregations expect certain kinds of behaviors from their ministers or their.
But those expectations aren't birthed in a vacuum. I think this is just me. I think all the characters in this book were people that Sherwood Anderson knew about.
Maybe.
I don't think any of them is made up from whole cloth.
I don't either, except I think one of the things Anderson does all the time, and we talked about this part before, he's always thinking about gender and how gender works in community. And he is always thinking about the role of the artist, and the artist takes a lot of forms. That's a Hawthorne thing too. Sometimes it's a teacher, sometimes it's a minister. But one of the things that's going on with Hartman, and I don't think Susan's wrong, you know, what is a midlife crisis anyway?
The realization you're gonna die.
Is it?
Yes.
Look, no, yes, no, yes.
Realizing you're already dead.
I mean, it's such an interesting question because there's so much culture stuff attached to that idea, yes? And mostly, as in American culture, we try to pin that on men, yes? You're the ones having the midlife crises, whereas the teachers are going, we've had those since we were 20, right? This questioning of what am I doing? Is my life meaningful? Is my work meaningful? And one of the kind of double whammies I would say for a minister is their work is supposed to make their life meaningful. But what if it doesn't? You know? And what?
Finding your job.
Right, which is what Hartman considers, yes, in a kind of creepy way, and we'll get there. And then there's that thing where part of him for this moment wishes he had this way of sparking something in people, getting them riled up. But at the same time, he feels like, well, that would be controversial if he became that person. And then I won't ask this. I mean, I'll ask it, but you don't have to answer. I mean, it's got to be a huge part of your jobs dealing with controversial ministers, yes? But then the question becomes, what is controversy?
One role of the minister, somebody mentioned, is pastoral care.
Yes.
We don't know whether the teacher was probably not a member of this congregation, but what typical habit, maybe, but what to me, and it's sort of jumping ahead, I don't think there's anything in the story about the ministers. Who's a good minister? I really just don't think that's in there. It's written from a sociological, critical, it's the sociological, naturalistic perspective. This is the way ministers behave in a small town. And this guy just needed a little romance and a little change in his life. And he was talking about inspiration from God. What it really meant was he wanted to have an adult relationship with somebody he was bored with his life.
Mhm.
And so that's what's going on. And had she been there with his congregation, he'd seen her in distress, naked or not naked, he would have said, this is another soul, it's a soul in my care, it's a fellow child of God, not a woman to be objectified or lusted after, but it's somebody I need to be careful. That's not in the story either, but that's what, if this was about his development, which I didn't have to think it's not, that would have been the Christian, that would have said, oh my God, I've come to myself, I've been sinning, because I would say his epiphany was exactly the opposite.
Okay, so that's
I'm
the
jumping ahead.
question, because I'm with you almost all the way there. Because I love that you brought up this idea that the other thing about a minister's role is pastoral care. And he makes clear that Kate Swift is not in his congregation, but the minute he starts thinking about her, because remember the first time he sees her, she's smoking. And he thinks, oh, that's so worldly, and he immediately attaches sin to that. But he doesn't have contact with her. He only has contact with his congregation. But the minute he starts thinking about her, he becomes a better minister. Now, this is where it gets weird.
Becomes a better, more well-rounded person.
Maybe.
He's listening to, he's realizing that he's human.
Yes, that's it. And part of what Anderson is doing is asking this question about teachers and preachers. You're right, it is sociological in that way. Do we think of them as real people? And do they experience and suffer the same kinds of boredom and malaise and feelings of insecurity the rest of us do, which we don't like to think about that, because that's the person we're going to for leadership, yes? And so you're reading this beautifully. What becomes weird and complicated in this story is what the role of Kate Swift is to Curtis. And does he have a spiritual epiphany or not? You think no.
I think he has a spiritual epiphany, which would be more likely to lead him out of the ministry, unless he's an extraordinary man for that generation. I seriously think his epiphany is, I don't believe anything. I got to get out of here.
Okay, hold on. He wondered if the flame of the Spirit really burned in him and dreamed of a day when a strong, sweet new current of power would come like a great wind into his voice and his soul, and the people would tremble before the Spirit of God made manifest in him. I am a poor stick, and that will never really happen to me, he mused dejectedly. So he starts watching. What?
Who is the character who thinks of himself as early on, who, praying for the son to be like, I mean, it's the same.
Jess.
Yeah, that's the same. Right?
Yeah. So he realizes that across the way is this woman, this school teacher, who's 30 years old, and this is important for the next story, had a neat, trim-looking figure. She had few friends and bore a reputation of having a sharp tongue. But she, had been to, Europe. So she was worldly. So we're going to let that one pass, that sin. And then you get some backstory on Curtis about he doesn't really have experience with women beyond, marrying the woman that lived in the boarding house. In the soul of the minister, a struggle awoke from wanting to reach the ears of Kate Swift, and through his sermons to delve into her soul. He began to want also to look again at the figure lying white and quiet in the bed. So there's a struggle when he sees her that first time sinning. The question becomes, is this struggle between the reason and emotion or reason and passion, and is there a way for him to get into a place that reinvigorates him as a man of God? Well, it gets creepy, right? Because, he just sort of breaks a little hole in the window, and watch what he does. Curtis Hartman forgot his sermon on that Sunday morning. He talked to his congregation, and in his talk said that it was a mistake for people to think of their minister as a man set aside and intended by nature to lead a blameless life. Out of my own experience, I know that we who are the ministers of God's word are beset by the same temptations that assail you. Fair? And so you're right. Maybe he's starting to figure out he's a human. What we think. I have been tempted and have surrendered to the temptation. It is only the hand of God placed beneath my head that has raised me up. And then he becomes, smug, yes? He thinks he's beaten temptation and that God, has intervened. And then he starts acting like, gives his wife a little of attention. Everything's cool. And now began the real struggle in the soul of the brown-bearded minister. By chance, he discovered that Kate Swift was in the habit of lying in her bed in the evenings and reading a book. In a way, he began to blame God, saying to himself that he had tried to keep his feet in the true path and had not run about seeking sin. Why now should I be tempted? What have I done that this burden should be laid on me?
Genesis.
3 times he's tempted. During the early fall and winter of that year, Curtis Hartman crept out of his house in the room in the bell tower to sit in the darkness, looking at the figure of Kate Swift lying in her bed, and later went to walk and pray in the streets. Then he just loses it. I will not repair the hole in the window, and I will train myself to come here at night and sit in the presence of this woman without raising my eyes. I mean, he's so full of it at this point, right?
Yes, right.
So he goes, you know what? You know what I'm going to do? I'm getting out of this pastor business. And I'm getting rid of the wife. And if I want to become wild, I'll become wild. I'm on 84 in my book, which probably is different from yours. The distracted man trembled from head to foot, partly from cold, partly from the struggle in which he was engaged. Hours passed, and a fever assailed his body. His throat began to hurt, and his teeth chattered. I will see this woman and will think the thoughts I have never dared to think. So he's right on the brink of just losing it completely. So this is what he does. Then upon the bed before his eyes, a naked woman threw herself, Kate. Lying face downward, she wept and beat with her fists upon the pillow. With a final outburst of weeping, she half arose, and in the presence of the man who had waited to look and to think thoughts, the woman of sin began to pray. In the lamplight, her figure, slim and strong, looked like the figure of the boy in the presence of Christ on the leaded window. Curtis Hartman never remembered how he got out of the church. With a cry, he arose, dragging the heavy desk along the floor. Along the street, he went and ran. Of course, he goes to see George, and he says this: after 10 years in this town, God has manifested himself to me in the body of a woman. What I took to be a trial of my soul was only a preparation for a new and more beautiful fervor of the Spirit. God has appeared to me in the person of Kate Swift, the school teacher kneeling naked on a bed. Do you know Kate Swift? Although she may not be aware of it, she is an instrument of God bearing the message of truth. I am delivered.
A little controversy.
So what do we do?
What does he do? What does he do then?
Well, what he does is he breaks the window.
Go back and try to preach.
We don't know.
We don't know.
That's the,
And it's also just full of this, if you read it, it's full of, it's delusional thinking. It's everything from Freud's rescue complex, Ford had been published by the Anderson. And this guy basically is deluding himself into believing he's now a good man or a fully rounded human being. And there's no evidence that he has any spiritual living here at all.
I don't know.
We don't know.
Because
What would it be? What would it be if it was a Christian impulse? What would it be? What would it look like?
Sue,
You could resurrect.
didn't you tell us, Sue, that Sherwood Anderson himself, though, went from being a married man, maybe with a family, whatever, and he left them, he decamped to pursue his hunger to be a writer.
Yeah.
He did what the preachers contemplate.
So this is
Right.
what we have to decide. All of your questions are right. I just don't have any answers. That's the modernist ambiguity, right? Because either you read it this way, that this guy is so full of it from the very beginning, and in order to self-preserve, he's turned this desire, which should humanize him, into a message from God.
But it's Jesse.
Yes.
He is Jesse. He's trying to find God in something, and he finally finds God in a naked woman.
Yes, and can you buy it?
Well, what he finds is life or something, or passion.
Yes, and what you have to, and it's both of these are not wrong. Either it's this or it's this.
Well, God is absent.
Yes. Well, not only is God absent, and that's an Anderson thing too, right? In this,
Window treatment.
yes. Yes. But not only is God absent, what Anderson is consistently showing is this desire within all of these isolated grotesques for whatever that spiritual meaning is. Where can you find it? But y'all, the other thing that's absent from this story is Kate Swift.
Totally objectified. She's totally objectified.
100%.
And this is a problem of all the religions, Christianity, Judaism. They're fighting in the streets in Iran right now to not be treated as objects.
Yes.
As women. That's also what it's about. He has the delusions of an errant pastor about women. That is, it's narcissism. At the bottom, it's narcissism. And that's what you see in your denomination and ours.
Yes.
That's what you see. That is what it's about. And they imagine that they're somehow going to be, God's messenger to some woman that they lust after. That's what it's about.
Yes, I think you are not wrong. I also think you are not wrong.
It reminds me of Joseph Smith, a Mormon who is married, is getting old, sees a 19-year-old woman and says, God wants me to be, but God is talking to me. So
Yes.
mistakes his own.
By lucky,
feelings.
wonderful happenstance, God wants to be what I want to be.
Y'all, everything you're saying is right. And the fact that the story can get you there is pretty good. That is, she's just a vessel, right? That he's writing his story on. And the story ends up really well for him, I guess, in his world. But then you've still got this child of God kneeling at her bedside, weeping. That's one way. The other is that, like the other story that we read about Jesse, what he sees in that woman is her humanity, his own humanity, and the humanity of his congregants. And then there is a possible rebirth. Still does not. I don't think we can figure a way. He doesn't rush over and try to see what's wrong with her. He doesn't try to bring her in. She's just a thing. So that's problematic. So then you get her story, and she's a mess too. Yes?
Everybody's a mess.
Yes. But Susan, are we all a mess?
Yes.
Thank you, amen. There you go. I preached for you tonight. What about her?
The one thing that I think you're asking about Kate Swift, right? I mean, the thing that she goes and tells George.
Yes.
That little passage seemed pretty important to me because she says, you've got to know what other people are thinking. And to me, all of these characters, they don't have any sort of relationship with other people. If you were to ask, one of the things when we're talking about what a minister has to be, to me, a minister has to be good at relationships and interested in other people.
Yes.
And
Watching is not good.
but she knows, to me, she knows what they're all, why they're all feeling empty, I suppose. But none of them are very good at it.
Well, and also, for me, she's like one of the most interesting characters in this book because the women don't do well in this book. But she reminds me of the beginning. Remember Wayne Biddlebaum? In the way that as a teacher, she is also supposed to be someone who inspires, someone who communicates. Does she do that with her students?
Ooh,
She does.
Well,
Most likely.
ooh.
Oh,
Sometimes she's talking to herself, it sounds like to me.
so as a teacher in the public, watch this. At the age of 30, Kate Swift was not known in Winesburg as a pretty woman. Her complexion was not good and her face was covered with blotches that indicated ill health. Alone in the night in the winter streets, she was lovely. So then we find out what kind of teacher she is. In reality, she was the most eagerly passionate soul among them. And more than once in the 5 years since she had come back from her travels to settle in Winesburg and become a school teacher, had been compelled to go out of the house and walk half through the night, fighting out some battle raging within. In public, as a teacher, she's very controlled, very put together, stern with those students. She keeps it together. But when she talks to them, there's passion. And they think she is funny. They think she is beautiful. And the question that we don't get answered is, what is she communicating? Because then we learn that she keeps thinking about George Willard. In something he had written as a schoolboy, she thought she had recognized the spark of genius and wanted to blow on that spark. The school teacher tried to bring home to the mind of the boy some conception of the difficulties he would have to face as a writer. You will have to know life, she declared. So in some ways, she understands more than Curtis Hartman, right? But the thing about being a minister or a teacher is you have to know the people. You have to recognize their humanity and your own. She is an imperfect person in Winesburg. Every single one of them is. And what you have to decide as a reader is which are the ones that seem to have some promise, or are they so spiritually bereft because there is no God in this town? Or do some of them have potential? She's the most passionate person in this town. She's trying to communicate to George that he has to stop fooling around with words all the time and get out there and live a life. A passionate desire to have him understand the import of life, to learn to interpret it truly and honestly, swept over her. Leaning forward, her lips brushed his cheek. At the same moment, he, for the first time, became aware of the marked beauty of her features. So every time this teacher wants to communicate, and note, unlike Wing, she doesn't use her hands. Every time she has something to tell that she wants to communicate, she's beautiful. Unfortunately, or fortunately, so strong was her passion that it became something physical. Again, her hands took hold of his shoulders and she turned him about. In the dim light, her eyes blazed. She arose and laughed. I must be going, she said. In a moment, if I stay, I'll be wanting to kiss you. In the newspaper office, a confusion arose. Kate Swift turned and walked to the door. She was a teacher, but she was also a woman. The school teacher let George Willard take her into his arms. When he came and put a hand on her shoulder, she turned and let her body fall heavily against him. For George Willard, the confusion was immediately increased. For a moment, he held the body of the woman tightly against his body, and then it stiffened. Two sharp little fists began to beat on his face. It was into this confusion that the Reverend Curtis Hartman protruded himself. When he came in, George Willard thought the town had gone mad. Don't blame him. Shaking a bleeding fist in the air, the minister proclaimed the woman George had only a moment before held in his arms, an instrument of God bearing a message of truth. This is where it's so cool. Is she? Is she a messenger of God bearing a truth? And maybe Curtis doesn't get it. And George doesn't get it. When George goes home, he starts really mulling it over, doesn't he?
Maybe I missed
Yes, that's exactly right. I have missed something. I have missed
That
something.
experience may not be unique to George. There may be other men in the world, maybe some in this room, well, never mind.
I have missed something Kate Swift was trying to tell me. So at this point, what we have to figure out, and gosh, y'all are so smart, is does he figure something out? Is he the one? He's the one she sees a spark in this place. And she goes to him and things get a little uncomfortable or too comfortable. She stops. Curtis Hartman stops, but they are not the same people. Do you get it? And what we have to figure out next week is, does George finally get it? What is it? And ultimately, what do we make of this book? But one of the other things I just love about these two chapters is that idea of community and separation, which is a huge part of everything Anderson ever did. This notion that we live together, but we are separate in so many ways. And some of that separation is because we are writing our own definitions on people. We're constantly interpreting and or judging their action from in here. Maybe not in here. And I love that part of what's going on here is that some of the subtext is suggesting, hey, y'all, your ministers, they have flaws too. They're people too. I know, is that sad? But guess what else, hey? Teachers are people too. And y'all, I'm not kidding. At least once a week, I will have to say that to my students. I will have to go, y'all, I'm a real person too. Like when they say things like, can you come and meet me at 7 o'clock at night to help me do blah, blah, blah? And I'll go, no. Or if something bad happens, like when I wasn't there last week, they were so kind. Once I said, y'all, I have to go to North Carolina because my daddy's in trouble. Okay, first of all, you're never allowed to say daddy in front of people that are 20 now. Did y'all know that? No. It's dirty. This is what I live with, Susan. What's the key? I mean, it is a visceral reaction. I know. And I grew up in rural South Carolina. That's my daddy. But they were so kind. But I had to say, y'all, I'm a real person with a father. And I have to go. You have to let me. And then they were lovely. But I had to say, because they're there and they are paying. And what do you think you're doing, right? So it's about not just who you are in here, but who these people are out here. And Anderson's great fear in 1918, 1915 through 1918, World War I, was that we were becoming so modernized and industrialized that God is starting to disappear. Whatever God is, whatever God was, is being replaced by all this other stuff.
Which is happening now.
This reads like a hopper painting.
But
Yeah,
I
that's
mean,
nice.
that's happened throughout human history. I mean, when the Hebrews
Yeah.
morphed from herdsmen to planters or whatever,
Yes.
you know, or went to Babylon, you know, how do we worship the Lord in a strange land, or how do we worship the God of the hills down here on the plain
Yeah.
in the town?
So is part of this estrangement natural progression? And if it is, how intentional And how much attention do we need to pay? Do you remember last week when I told you that in a Christian university, I had zero students who could tell me the creation story in Genesis?
I quoted it as 2 out of 50. I told something.
That's right, you're right, 2 out of 50.
Yeah.
And they didn't even
And
get
I
all
I
the,
repeated that story.
and they didn't even get all the facts right, but there were 2 that kind of knew. So yeah, 100 years later, pay attention.
Do you think the Great Awakening that happened around the 20s and 30s was a result of modernism, bringing those kind of perspectives to?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many periods called the Great Awakening in America, but
Well, the revival is.
generally that hopefully is what happens. I mean, I told y'all last week, only 2 out of 50, but they want, and they can articulate what they want in terms of communion, in terms of believing in something, in terms of community, but they don't know where to find it. And they're so distracted by anything. Yeah, it's true. This semester, somebody was asking me this last week too, and I'll finish real quick. And I'm doing a presentation on this tomorrow about the students since COVID, how difficult it is. And I'm doing this presentation with my friend Jason, and he sent me an email today and said, this is the 4th note today I've written because our students aren't coming to class. They're just disappearing.
They're not coming to class.
Not coming to class. And I told him if I had time, I would count how many times people have been absent this semester. That never happens to Sue Trout, never. And so one of the things I'm doing this semester to try to understand them a little bit better is I'm making them keep commonplace books, which are just books where they write, but also you can give them exercises. And so 3 times so far, because it's midterm, just after midterm, and I say, what's going on? I'm just checking on you. You know, their hearts are bleeding. And they are so willing to say, I have lost motivation for learning. I have no motivation for it. In part because they feel so hopeless about now, about the future, about where they're going to be. And that's what's happening. It's heartbreaking. And so I'm trying this exercise. It's an experiment to see, because some of them are already saying, I thought I was going to hate this, but I love it. Thanks for listening. That's what they say. Thanks for listening. Because we're in college. I don't have time to go, how are you today? And how are you feeling? And but in this way, they can tell me they want. So maybe that's the hope.
The birth of the church, I think, was grounded in sheer desperation.
Yeah.
And then a connection with the human condition.
Yeah.
That we need one another.
Yes. We got to figure out how that's going to work moving forward, you know?
And in that is God. the Spirit.
Yes. And
Something
it's
that
not
we can't understand.
God wrapped up in a rock band and everything else, which is a lot of their idea of what church is and actually what it's for. It's become another social thing like social media. And how do you break through? That's the big question, right? And one of the reasons I love these stories together is because, and this is what my husband said, because he goes, well, now what are y'all talking about tonight? Never read this book. And so I was trying to tell him, and he goes, but aren't teachers and preachers kind of the same thing? And I went, God, I hope so. You know, I really do. So let's finish next week, see what happens to George. Is he the one that gets it finally? And is one person enough for hope? Good deal? You can finish this. This was a short one, wasn't it?
How was your symposium on,
Oh my gosh, it was so good. Why weren't y'all there? I know you were not in the country. I forgive you. It was so great.
It looked fabulous.
That Margaret Ringel is
Oh, yeah.
like a joy in the universe.
Yeah.
She's a teacher preacher.
Yeah.
And then it's just so much about
You know,
praise.
do you remember that piece you wrote in the Times about, basically Sabbath taking rest time?
Yes.
I actually on that, she said, I'll teach them something else. You have written something. Like, are you kidding me?
Keep having to reread it. I mean, I think I'll have it, and then I'll go a few more, and then I'll go, oh, here this is. Like, oh, I'm gonna go back to it. This was great. I hope it's not understanding. I think it's performance. I think we skipped some, is that right? I mean, I read on it, it looks like. Yeah, so it's very confusing. The one about the man, marries the tall blonde, and buys the house, and he's a telegraph operator, and, you know, it's looking really grotesque, but it flashes back, and she takes on 3 lovers while they're married, and then the mother shows, maybe it wasn't behind, maybe it's coming up, not spoiler, but I did look at the others, I was I just love it. That one is like. Yeah. Good to see you all.
Yeah, I saw you were on.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't say,
She talked with me, so it was all, it happened about 3 weeks after I left. Yeah. And, you know, thinking about going back next summer. What's that gonna be like? Because
yeah.
you know, there's something. Well, let's bring in the answer.
That's what I heard
Well, we haven't made, you mean, next week or next spring? We haven't talked about it. Yeah.
Right.
Like me?
Oh, no.
I mean,
Oh, no, Sid, you want to do that? Let me read I know, I need to bring you to class. You tell my friends
I will. Thank you.
I said hello.
I will.
I love them, but and we missed him at school, but he would always finish your
That's a great, it's a, to me, it's like,
Sitting on the.
So one of the things that Doug said is that this book reminded him of growing up in Franklin. Seeing these different, which I love, yeah.
That was an experience.
Good night, buddy. Good night, Carolyn.
yeah, but I, 4,000 people, and another guy who rebels, goes to jail, steals everybody's money, and he's forced to the church. You know, and people don't have their money back, he's gone to prison, but he's in church, and we just live with that.
Right age for even smaller.
Infection that's going around causes blood clots. So I keep on here.
Didn't have a license, and he was so direct.
Oh, yeah.
Sure.
I said, well, he doesn't do that, he's sort of the event plan, you know? I mean, I'm like, okay, we had to pay him, but it's not.
Yeah, I think it's.
That's the big remarkable thing, is how it just going.
And what did Ray's family do for a living?
They had
Oh, you know.
I do it, yeah. No, yeah, exactly,
Get out.
yeah.
My daughter's,
The Carolina,
Father-in-law.
the Carolina Blue
Did
Company.
he marry the heiress?
oh my God.
Yeah.